25 most terrifying maniacs and murderers in human history. We are starting a series of publications about the most frightening and dark serial killers in human history. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode.
Larry Gene Bell, the voice that called in the night prologue. The telephone line where pauses lived, the line crackled as if something had moved into its insulation. What came through the receiver wasn't a voice so much as a habit of speaking. He switched between the formal "Sir, ma'am" and a neighborly "you," changing masks not out of courtesy but to control whoever was listening. "Did you get the letter?" he asked, and even the questions sounded like an order. In the next room someone was praying. In another, someone hovered over the recorder, afraid to miss the button. Days shrank down to phone calls. Calls became the weather by which time was measured. This is the story of that voice, the one that turned a telephone into a weaponized stage. But it began much earlier, on nameless southern roads where the dust lies so evenly it feels as though someone combs it every evening. Part 1. A biography told by a draft. Larry Gene Bell was born on October 30, 1949, in a small, almost mapless place in Alabama. His family moved the way water moves when it lacks banks: Alabama, South Carolina, Mississippi. Moves like that pry a child loose from time. No familiar school, no neighbors to borrow salt from, no yard where you've been known since you were 6. There are suitcases and snatches of kitchen conversations in other people's houses. In high school he kept to corners, neither leader nor outcast, just in between. People praised his hands. He could fix things, soldered cleanly, didn't fear current. That gift led him into electrical work. He liked wielding power over the invisible. He briefly enlisted in the Marines, and just as quickly fell out after a ridiculous injury cleaning a weapon, a shot, pain, discharge papers. An even shorter stint as a prison guard followed. They issued the uniform and read the instructions, and then it turned out discipline isn't about having power, it's about self-control, and with that he had a separate argument. He married, divorced, and worked job to job, electrician, hand for hire, the man who watches your house while you're away. A son was born, and maybe those were the best moments of his life. A rare photo where he holds the child, looking into the lens with that odd expression of someone trying to believe everything is just beginning. But for Larry, everything began many times and never continued. Psychiatrists sketch a faint pencil line: early sexualized fantasies plus a fetish for silence and submission plus a life without long bonds. As a teen he liked turning a stranger's back into a surface for his stare, an unhealthy curiosity no one treats because boys will be boys.
Only the boy grows up, and the habit descends. Part 2.
Shadows before the storm: police archives of the 1970s and 1980s house cases with no ending. Among them is the 1975 disappearance of 21-year-old Denise Porch in Charlotte. Larry lived not far away, worked as an electrician, could have known her route. There wasn't enough proof, just coincidences lying beside the letter like spare paper clips. Then, November 1984, 26-year-old Sandy Elaine Cornett vanishes. The threads lead toward the airport, to friends of friends, to a man who could talk in a way that made you trust him with your keys. Not yet an assault, rehearsals of control, invisible, nighttime, a pattern disguised as accident. Only the accident repeats with too much confidence.
Part 3.
May 1985, the breaking of bright plans. May 31st. The mailbox morning was memorable not for strangeness but for normalcy: warm grass, birds reading notes off the lines. 17-year-old Shari Faye Smith stepped to the mailbox at the edge of the yard. Her keys and bag stayed in the car dash. "I'll just be a minute." That is the vulnerability warnings describe, the threshold between home and outside, where we're mentally still at home but physically already in a world without guarantees. They found the car almost right away empty. The house drew into itself as if it were alive, breathing shallow. The telephone became its central vein. The call did not come that minute or that hour, but soon enough that the spasm of hope never passed. The voice would speak evenly, hold its pauses, test how each word landed. June 3rd to 5th. A letter written with pressure, an envelope arrived with a sheet penned by Shari's own hand, a last will and testament of the sort from old world rhetoric classes. Clear, tender, unervingly adult. She might have become a lawyer or a doctor, the prose betrayed it. But besides the ink on the page, there remained the impressed trace of another number, ghostly digits transferred from the upper sheet where someone had once pressed a pen too hard. Technicians raked a slant of light across the paper and a whole phone number rose out of the fibers like a watermark. It led to a house where Larry House sat, and used the landline the way a director uses a console in his booth.
Calls came.
He gave details that were too exact not to help but to own the stage. He spoke of adhesive tape the way a chef speaks of a knife, calmly, professionally, without emotion. Anyone who later heard those recordings felt a coldness in the gut. He took pleasure less in pain than in the world's obedience to his voice.
June 14th.
A midday that turned the day upside down in a trailer park. In air warm with dust and corn, 9-year-old Debra May Helmick was playing near home. A silvery car traced an arc and stopped precise as with a compass. A man got out, approached, scooped the child as if he were a father, and carried her away. A neighbor caught the first letter of the plate and the model. In broad daylight, with witnesses, the boldest form of control is to show you cannot be stopped. A few days later, the encore, the voice again gave directions to a body. Repetition is ritual. Ritual is music. Profiling listens to that music for character.
Part 4.
The investigator's open kitchen. Craft against theater. What takes minutes today stretched into hours then. Analog lines didn't yield. Here are the coordinates, but maybe we can reach the switchboard in time. That made recording discipline priceless. Every call on tape, integration with profiling essential. How to speak, what to ask, which prompts increase the chance of a slip, and above all the page with the impressed digits. Not glossy showmanship, but the artisan's victory. The team tied knots of probability, the house where Larry watched over things and called, routes overlapping the sites the voice mentioned, the car like a '78 Buick Riviera described by the witness, and finally a stop at a roadblock, a trunk lifted, a second plate, an extra identity caught glinting. With hairs that matched microscopically, the case became a woven fabric of proof. Somewhere off camera sat a man named John Douglas, the profiler who calls such offenders control sadists. Not content merely to do, they must also conduct the reactions afterward.
Part 5.
Psychological portrait. The man who wanted to switch off other people's voices. 1. Staged intimacy. A telephone is intimate. We press it to the ear and let a voice inside. Larry knew this instinctively. In each call he created the illusion of a joint story. We'll work this out now. But his we never meant two humans. We was him and his role. The rest were an audience.
2. A Fetisch for Brit en Silence.
His weapon wasn't a bullet but the voice switch.
Tape, Telefone, pauses different phases of one fixation. You go silent, I will speak. 3. Split self.
His good Larry and bad Larry weren't diagnoses from a manual but a homemade moral mask. Convenient. Responsibility is shifted from the self as a whole to the bad act that takes over. In practice, his bad self was the director and the good self the spectator, granted only the choice of a seat.
4. Risk factors.
A drifting childhood, early unprocessed sexual scripts, short stints of power, a guard, a uniform, electric current, no durable attachments or boundaries. Together they form a magnet for scenarios where control outweighs empathy.
Part 6. The victims.
Not figures in a file, but people we're obliged to speak of them as more than properties of evidence. Shari Faye Smith, 17. Luminous, smart, decisive, with that astonishing clarity of prose you rarely meet at 17. She loved to sing, loved to plan, and could calm others with a single tone. Her last will isn't horror lit, it's a letter of love in which the world didn't fall apart, though it had every reason to.
Debra May Helmick, 9.
That age where they suddenly lengthen but still have baby faces. Her yard was simple, a bicycle, dust, the neighbor's dog. A noon abduction felt like someone had barged onto the stage of a school pageant and cut the music. Sandy Elaine Cornett, 26. A young woman with adult plans, work, relationships, a grown-up city. Her disappearance was this story's prelude. Years later, when the department reread its folders, a name Larry Jean Bell surfaced like a link that had always been in the text but no one had clicked.
Denise Porch, 21, probable.
A reminder that signature can be louder than direct proof. No final rulings, no trumpet lines, memory and questions that keep a system awake.
Part 7.
The Month of Terror Chronicle. Day by day, like a duty log. May 31, 1985. Shari is abducted at the mailbox. The car is found. The household adopts the ritual of listening for the phone. June 3 to 5. A run of calls, the last will, the impressed number that grows into a branch of the investigation.
June 6 to 10th.
Interviews, roadblocks, the brute force labor of trying to localize analog calls in an era when geolocation meant linemen and wires.
June 14, da Utime.
Debra May Helmick is taken in front of neighbors, a silvery car, the plate's first letter.
June 22nd.
At the voice's direction, her body is found. The ritual repeats. June 23 to 26th. The house he watched becomes the diagram center. Technicians read a page with slant light.
June 27. A Buick Riviera stoppet. A spare plate, an arrest. July December.
Labs, interviews, the knitting of evidence. The Smiths emerge from nightmare into cautious daylight. When they appear in news footage, it isn't for sensation but as an example of human participation in justice.
Part 8.
Where the system held, and where it sagged in error isn't always someone did it wrong. Sometimes its technology couldn't keep up.
1. The phone.
The analog environment gave the offender a head start. Too many ifs: if we reach the right switchboard in time, if the line holds. Don't blame people, blame the physics of copper.
2. Interjuridiction SIM.
Lexington, Richland, Charlotte archives like to live by their own laws. Integration existed but had to be stitched on the run. The case taught a lesson: data joining isn't a luxury.
3. The court's gatekeeping.
The defense had logic in trying to keep out recordings from the other case. The jury will be prejudiced. The state's high court explained why this was an exceptional instance of one plan, one scheme, one signature, not an attempt to smear a defendant with unrelated prior bad acts.
4. The psychiatric line.
Subtleties around guilty but mentally ill and jury instructions were argued long and hard. But the architecture of evidence and the logic of behavior proved stronger than elegant cross-examinations. Taken together, the case doesn't display a collapse but professional courage. In a pre-digital world, they caught a man who turned a telephone into theater.
Part 9.
The day of the arrest. When threads tie into a knot, it wasn't Hollywood.
No helicopters, no freeze.
Just a roadblock, routine papers, a raised trunk, and the shadow of a second plate. Each item alone was nothing. In context, they were the sand grains in an hourglass already poured to one side. Larry watched calmly the man who thought scripts were written by him. He didn't yet know the page with the digits had begun speaking for him.
Part 10.
Trying the voice. 2 acts, 1 sentence. Act 1. Shari. The courtroom listened to tapes. There were no screams, only certainty. The prosecutor insisted this voice wasn't a person on a line, it was the author of the crime. The defense sought shelter in psychiatry, in hair-thin jury instructions, in the hope of what if. The jury didn't stay out long.
They returned heavy-footed, death.
On appeal, the courts left it. Yes, a few of the prosecutor's flourishes could be debated, but the massive proof and behavioral logic were immovable. Act 2. Debra. Now the hinge. Could the earlier tapes enter the new trial? The court ruled that they could because Larry himself sutured the 2 stories: abduction, phone call, direction, body. This was not character assassination, but the revelation of a pattern.
The sentence repeated, death. The state Supreme Court affirmed.
Between the acts, federal corridors, he went to federal court's habeas corpus as the final artery. Prejudice, incompetence, trial error, the same chorus. The court stayed deaf to theater where arguments were shadow and facts had flesh.
Part 11.
The waiting corridor and the choice of current death row is a long hallway. In it, people write letters, find religions, argue with walls. Larry had time to stage one last gesture of control. He chose the electric chair over injection, as if in this at least he remained the author. On October 4, 1996, the current drew a period, but he said no last words. Perhaps that was just, for the first time, his voice wasn't required.
Part 12 des Postscriptus Victims. Hose living go on the Smiths a separate story of courage.
They took calls no one should take. They spoke to a man no one should speak to. Their voices did not quaver enough to make the investigation lose its thread. They found the strength to become part of justice without betraying their love. Memory hurts, but it didn't burn black, it clarified. Debra's family are people of quiet stamina. Trailer parks have thin walls but strong hearts. Their testimony, that first letter of the plate, their willingness to go down to the station one more time, these rarely appear in end credits.
They should.
It is ordinary solidarity that binds such cases together. Sandy Cornett's name, spoken officially years later, felt like a city finally saying her aloud. That matters more than a headline. To name is to restore dignity.
Part 13.
Dense chronology, extended scale, 10301949, birth of Larry Jean Bell.
A childhood in Moshan.
1960s school years, the growth of quiet voyeuristic curiosity, early sexualized fantasies. Late 1960s, early 1970s, attempted military service, injury, a brief prison guard interlude, departure. 1970s, electrician, house sitter, fragmented relationships. 07311975, disappearance of Denise Porch, probable connection. 11181984, disappearance of Sandy Elaine Cornett, links to Larry's orbit. 05311985, Shari abducted at the mailbox, Lexington County, SC. 0603-06051985 calls, the last will, the impressed number. 0606-06131985, broad searches, interviews, profiling woven into tactics. 06141985, abduction of Debra May Helmick, Richland County. Witness, silvery car, plate beginning with D. 06221985, Debra's body found at the caller's direction. 06271985, arrest.
Buick Riviera, spare plate.
1986, trial for Shari.
Sentence, death.
1987, appellate affirmances, trial for Debra.
Sentence, death.
1990, State Supreme Court upholds. 1994 to 1995, federal habeas, denied. 100419996, execution by electric chair. 2000s and after, documentaries reframing the role of family and profilers. 2020s, official linkage of Belle to Sandy Cornett's disappearance.
Part 14.
What made Belle, factors and the mechanics of escalation, expanded, a nomadic upbringing. A child learns the world won't hold him, therefore he must hold the world. That often breeds a love for scenarios where you decide, even when there's nothing to decide. Early sexualization and a fetish for silence. If a fantasy of I am the switch lives long enough, real life becomes a search for buttons.
He found two, the telephone and the tape. Episodic power.
A guard for a month, an electrician on call. Roles where power is a temporary crutch. You begin wanting something you don't have to take off at night. Crime becomes a surrogate permanence.
Religious moral self-drama.
There Are Two of Me is a convenient play, applause for remorse built into the script and permission for the bad one to come back on stage. Technical windows of victim vulnerability. A front stoop, a daytime yard, a 1-minute stop reel holes in our defenses at which such a psyche aims automatically. These factors excuse nothing, but they help us see the mechanisms, and seeing lets us put grills where curtains used to be.
Part 15.
Lessons for the system. 5 unvarnished theses. Thesis 1. Not every error is an error. Sometimes it's the limit of the era, wires instead of satellites, a magnifying glass instead of a database.
Thesis 2.
Joining jurisdictions isn't bureaucracy, it's safety. Shared bases, shared signatures are what thicken thin ice between cases.
Thesis 3.
Profiling works when it's sewn into tactics. Not fortune-telling but psycholinguistics, tempo, pauses, pronouns, the hooks that coax an offender to repeat his signature.
Thesis 4.
The criminalist's craft defeats the offender's theatricality. An impressed digit on a page is a small victory over a big evil.
Thesis 5.
Families who kept their voices are not only victims but participants in justice. They brought not only tears to the table but endurance, without which the outcome changes.
Part 16.
Scenes that stayed outside the record. Scene 1. The kitchen after the first call. Cups sit untouched. Someone wipes the counter in meaningless circles. A note on the fridge under a magnet. Groceries now includes the word tapes.
Scene 2.
In the lab, a dark room, the light skews in at a sharp angle. The technician bends as if listening to the paper with an ear. Numbers emerge slowly as though the cellulose itself were remembering who once pressed a pen there.
Scene 3.
The roadblock. A young patrolman, after a couple of dull shifts, looks into a trunk and suddenly knows his whole biography until this second was only a warm-up. The spare plate glints like an extra tooth.
Scene 4.
The courtroom. The tape plays and no one coughs. Each yes and no weighs like a stone. The prosecutor stands to the side, letting the voice speak for the state. It's a rare moment when the accuser is the offender himself.
Part 17. What if?
What if someone in the 1970s had noticed the silence fetish and sent the boy to therapy? What if telephony had pinned call origins in seconds? What if departments had swapped signature notes a year earlier? History dislikes the subjunctive. But systems must ask those questions in order to learn. And they did. Protocols were born for interagency handshakes, risk windows in prevention, even school talks about boundaries and the safety of thresholds. Epilogue. When the lever dropped and the current ran through the copper bars, South Carolina fell quieter, not because justice had prevailed, but because the voice went silent. It had dictated tempo and pauses for so long that the quiet sounded like rare music. No false promises, no choreography of pain. But quiet isn't an ending. It's a pause in which people must speak with their own human voices.
Some wäre on an Investigators Shelf ließ in Folder.
Between the reports is that very sheet on which, under raked light, the impressed telephone number appeared. Paper remembers better than we do. Its fibers hold not only digits but a craft, patience, precision, and the belief that the world can be saved by a magnifier and a desk lamp. If this story has a winner, it is attentiveness turned into habit. Somewhere in the Smith home, the phone no longer lives at the bedside. Sometimes Shari's letter is reread not to return to June 1985 but to keep her tone alive, clear, adult, astonishingly reassuring for 17. That letter became not evidence, but a family prayer of dignity that could not be stolen. In the trailer park where Debra grew up, neighbors still argue about the weather and trim their grass. The walls are just as thin, but people hear one another better now. And the name Sandy Cornett spoken officially years later sounds less like a headline than like a debt finally paid. The system changed too. Between departments now run not only telephone lines but databases, shared signature cards, fast channels for verification. Profilers learn to hear the pauses as well as the words. Telecommunications operators are no longer helpless before the analog night. Windows of vulnerability, the front stoop, the mailbox, the 1-minute stop appear in school lessons as naturally as rules for crossing the street. It doesn't make the world impregnable, but it makes it more attentive to boundaries. Was it right to execute him? Even those who held the evidence in their hands disagree. What is certain is this: the last scrap of control he cherished choosing the current returned nothing to anyone. Not a single stolen minute, not a single morning that never came.
The des Penalty dos not heal the past.
But the trial, the appeals, the strict formulas of rulings, these do tend to heal the future. They restore meaning to the words rule and procedure, without which any justice turns into a scream. We like to explain evil with monsters. It's comfortable to believe it's someone else, a glitch in the grid. But Bell is not outside our world. He comes from its cracks, a nomadic childhood, early distorted fantasies, the taste of power without responsibility, a talent for imitating closeness. If there is a moral, it is not about fear or rage. It is about the long, unglamorous work of sealing cracks, helping adolescents where fetishes of silence are born, teaching parents the simple rules of thresholds, joining jurisdictions without vanity or paper jealousy. His voice no longer sounds in this story, and that is right. Other voices remain, and the stage belongs to them now. The voice of a mother reading her daughter's letter without tears because the tears have all been spent. The voice of a neighbor who bothered to report the first letter on a license plate. The voice of a technician saying, "Rake the light, please," and the light is indeed raked. The voice of a judge who does not raise his tone, because the power of law lies in not shouting. Let the final image be the simplest: morning, a mailbox by the road, keys left in a car. That fragile instant between home and the world. One can live without glancing back every 3 steps. But one can also, in passing, look up from the phone and around. One can carry not fear but a skill. Darkness does not vanish, it merely understands it is being listened to more closely. Larry Gene Bell wanted to switch off other people's voices and dictate his own pauses. The paradoxical end of his life taught us to speak for ourselves and listen to one another. Paper remembered the phone, people remembered each other. And sometimes that is enough for a day to pass without the call no one should have to hear.